Hi, I'm Lina. Welcome to Lina's Storybook, where we share the most unforgettable audio novels. Let's get started.
In my previous life, I abandoned my home and bled myself dry for 20 years, just to give my children the world. I bought them houses, cars, and elite educations, only to be utterly despised for being an absent, terrible mother. My husband, right up until his dying breath, praised my sister-in-law as the true epitome of a good woman. The sheer suffocating betrayal of it all gave me breast cancer. And when I died, not a single one of my 3 children came to see me. But fate has a funny way of working things out. I've been reborn, and this time, I've decided. I am going to be a truly terrible mother. Mom, are you really leaving? If you dare to walk out that door today, I'll never acknowledge you as my mother again. The sharp, desperate punch of my little girl landed squarely on my stomach. The dull thud of pain radiating from my abdomen was exactly what I needed to snap awake from the lingering, suffocating haze of death. The winter air in the room was brutally cold, a stark, biting contrast to the sterile, climate-controlled oncology ward I had just perished in. I shoved her away from me, making no effort to hide the absolute disgust welling up in my eyes. Stumbling backward from my sudden, forceful rejection, my daughter's tiny, frail body began to tremble like a fragile leaf in a blizzard. Her wide, tear-filled eyes stared at me in profound shock. I stared back, equally paralyzed by the bizarre scene unfolding before me. Wait. Something was incredibly wrong. Why had my grown, estranged daughter suddenly turned back into a little kid? My gaze swept over the cramped, dilapidated wooden farmhouse. The drafty floorboards, the low, sagging ceiling lined with water stains, the frost creeping up the single-pane windows. Every detail was a blast from a deeply buried past. After a moment of stunned, breathless silence, the impossible reality crashed over me. I had been reborn. I had traveled all the way from my miserable lonely end in 2026. Straight back to the biting, bitter winter of 2003. In my previous life, it was exactly at this moment that I had made the most fatal mistake of my existence. Ignoring the fierce resistance of my husband and the tearful pleas of my children, I had obstinately dragged him away to a massive bustling industrial city on the coast to find factory work. The rural economy was dead, and I believed I was saving us all. For 20 agonizing years I lived the life of a drifter, breaking my back day in and day out without a single day's rest. Constantly chasing the next paycheck, I worked triple shifts in freezing warehouses and sweltering kitchens just to build a massive, beautiful new house for the family back home. I paid exorbitant tuitions to send all 3 of my children to elite universities. And when they graduated, I bought them pristine suburban houses and shiny new cars. But did they appreciate it? Not even a fraction of an ounce of gratitude was ever shown. Instead, they harbored a deep, venomous resentment toward me for failing to fulfill my duties as a present mother, eventually severing all ties with me entirely. My husband, Rick, was no better. He despised my strong, commanding personality and blamed me entirely for our children's emotional distance. He wallowed in self-pity, drinking heavily, chain-smoking cheap cigarettes, and indulging in every vice until his body broke down into a festering mass of disease. I will never forget the moment right before he died. He lay in his hospital bed, staring at me with hollow, lifeless eyes. His voice was a raspy whisper as he delivered his final blow. "Look at what you did to this family. My brother's wife, Sarah, she's the true good woman." And with those ungrateful words, he breathed his last. I didn't even get to defend myself or scream at him for his sheer audacity. That single breath of indignation, that suffocating lump of pure, unadulterated rage, lodged itself in my chest and festered there for 3 whole years without release, ultimately mutating into aggressive breast cancer. When I was dying, hooked up to machines that hummed a hollow tune, not a single one of my 3 children could be reached. They ignored my calls, leaving me to die with my eyes wide open, consumed by an unbearable sense of injustice. Yet, against all odds, the universe had hit the reset button. I opened my eyes to find myself right back in the very moment before Rick and I were supposed to pack our bags for the city. Looking down at my daughter's face, streaked with fresh tears and flushed from the cold, my heart felt like a solid block of ice. utterly devoid of the maternal warmth I used to harbor for her. Yet, on the surface I forced a gentle reassuring smile onto my face. "Okay, mommy won't go," I cooed, my voice dripping with an artificial sweetness. "How could making money ever be more important than staying here and keeping you company?" I shifted my gaze to my husband, Rick. He was still so young in 2003. Aside from his skin being deeply tanned and weathered from years of harsh agricultural labor, he was actually quite handsome, possessing a rugged, undeniable charm. But as I looked at his youthful features, my mind couldn't help but uncontrollably superimpose the horrific image of him from my past life. His bloated, jaundiced skin, his body covered in foul-smelling, festering bedsores. That pathetic, rotting corpse was what he was naturally destined to become. It was me, with over 20 years of my actual blood, sweat, and relentless sacrifice, who had nourished and sustained them all. And it was precisely because I had kept their bellies full and their bank accounts padded that they had the luxury and the absolute gall to spout sarcastic, privileged nonsense like, "I don't want the money you earned. I want the presence and companionship of my parents. Don't you understand?" No, I didn't understand. When the pantry is empty and the winter wind is howling through the cracks in the wall, which is more important? Sheer survival, or sitting around holding hands? Rick met my intense gaze and immediately flinched, guiltily averting his eyes to the floorboards. He nervously rubbed the back of his neck and muttered, "It wasn't me who taught her to say that." I maintained my overly sweet, accommodating smile and replied smoothly, "I understand perfectly. It was entirely my lack of foresight. I was only thinking about making a living, completely blind to the fact that the children couldn't bear to part with us. Well, I've made up my mind. I'm not going to the city to work. From now on, I'll stay right here at home, and our family will remain neatly and happily together." Rick, whose inherent nature was incredibly lazy and conflict avoidant, visibly brightened, hearing that I had officially declared we didn't have to leave the comfort of our town. He beamed with unmistakable relief and joy. That is fine. We can just take our time and slowly figure out a way to make some money," he offered vaguely. Slowly figure out a way. Right. I mentally calculated our grim reality. There were exactly 4 days left until the new school semester started, and hidden in a rusty tin jar in the kitchen, we had a grand total of just over $300 to our name. And out of that pathetic sum, $200 was actually my own secret emergency stash. "You are the man of this house," I said, my voice adopting a tone of pure submissive obedience. "I will listen to whatever you decide." In my previous life, I had been far too headstrong and unyielding. I took it upon myself to make every difficult decision, forcibly pushing this heavy, reluctant family forward upon my own shoulders. I exhausted myself to the bone, only to be covered head to toe in their bitter resentment and endless complaints. This time, I was done steering the ship. I would happily play the role of the mindless, agreeable echo chamber and watch them sink. By now, all 3 of my children were trailing closely behind me, hovering around my legs like anxious ducklings, terrified that I might suddenly make a run for it. My eldest son, Mason, was 8 years old and in the 3rd grade. My second son, Lucas, was 6 and had just started 1st grade, while my youngest daughter, Lily, was only 4 and hadn't even begun preschool yet. Looking down into those 3 pairs of wide, innocent eyes filled with desperate attachment, my heart experienced a fleeting, involuntary moment of softness, but the weakness vanished as quickly as it came. I simply could not erase the agonizing memory of my past life, my body ravaged and tortured by the relentless pain of cancer. Clutching my phone in the dark, every desperate call I made to them was met with an endless echoing busy signal. I could never ever forgive them. They essentially stood by and watched me die, refusing to grant me the basic dignity of a single final visit. What heinous, unforgivable crime had I possibly committed to warrant such a cruel, desolate end? "Go on. All of you go out and play," I commanded, waving my hands in a dismissive, highly irritated manner, shooing them toward the front door. All 3 children froze, staring at me in absolute shock. Normally, I was an incredibly strict disciplinarian. With the new semester just days away, none of them had even touched their mandatory winter break assignments, and they expected me to yell at them to get to work. But now, I couldn't care less what happened to their education. The moment the two boys realized they were actually being excused from their dreaded homework, they jumped 3 feet in the air with uncontainable joy. Little Lily looked nervously between her cheering brothers and my impassive face, ultimately deciding to follow her siblings out into the freezing yard. I walked into the bedroom and practically collapsed onto the worn mattress. No wonder people in the future loved the concept of lying flat. Giving up the hustle was unbelievably comfortable. In my past life, working away from home was an exercise in extreme, punishing labor. At my absolute most ruthless pace, I was juggling 3 separate menial jobs a day, in a single year. After strictly deducting my meager living expenses and the substantial sums I continuously mailed back to the children, I still miraculously managed to save up $10,000. You have to understand the sheer magnitude of that accomplishment. In 2003, the average annual income for a struggling farming family, in our Forgotten Valley, was barely around $2,500, but I was possessed by an unrelenting drive. Through sheer grit, I managed to replace this crumbling wooden farmhouse with a beautiful modern 3-story home. I funded all 3 children through their expensive high schools and elite universities, and even bought them pristine properties and cars in the city. Yet, the moment they achieved their own success and status, they looked at me as if I were their sworn enemy. Conversely, they treated Rick's older sister-in-law, Aunt Sarah, with boundless filial piety and utmost devotion. They had the nerve to claim that if it hadn't been for their Aunt Sarah, they wouldn't be where they were today. It was utterly, laughably absurd. At this point in time, my parents-in-law were only 50 years old, which was considered quite young and capable by rural farming standards. Every single year, I mailed them a handsome sum of $3,000, specifically designated for my children's living expenses and childcare. Since public schooling in our district was completely free and mandatory, that money only needed to cover basic school supplies and groceries. There was absolutely, without a doubt, a significant surplus left over for them to enjoy. Rick's older brother, Tom, and his wife, Sarah, also had 3 children of their own, 2 boys and a girl. The couple had spent their entire lives working the land, completely unbothered by ambition. As a direct result of their lack of foresight, their children had dropped out of school right after junior high, leaving early to take up grueling, low-paying manual labor jobs. My deepest, most paralyzing fear used to be that my own children would end up trapped in that exact same cycle of poverty. Because of that fear, I called home constantly, strictly demanding that they focus entirely on their studies, and the result? They became highly successful, wealthy professionals. But the people they ultimately decided to reward and care for were Tom and Sarah. My children practically moved them to the city to enjoy a life of luxury and comfort. The memory of my husband's severe illness came rushing back. Aunt Sarah had come to the city hospital to visit him. Her hair was freshly permed into elegant curls, and her fingers sparkled with heavy gold rings. Her skin was plump, pale, and pampered. She looked easily more than 10 years younger than my haggard, weather-beaten self. Standing by his bed, she looked down at Rick with profound pity and said, "You've had such a difficult, unbearable life. I told you back then, what good could possibly come from leaving home to work? Yes, staying in the village means you're a bit poorer, and life is a bit harder, but getting to watch the children grow up every day, isn't that the greatest happiness?" She sighed dramatically, adjusting her gold rings. "A person who never has to leave their home is a truly blessed person. You've drifted out there in the cold world for half your life, never enjoying a single day of real blessing. It is truly a sin." As she spoke, thick tears rolled down the corners of Rick's eyes, his gaze fixed on her, with an expression of obsessive, tragic longing. He didn't look away from her, until long after she had finally left the room. "Sarah, she is a good woman," he choked out. "My brother is truly a lucky man." And with that final devastating declaration, He stopped breathing. I was so paralyzed by shock and betrayal that I couldn't even muster the strength to curse at him or strike him. That massive suffocating block of anger wedged itself deep in my chest, literally killing me from the inside out. I had been such an unbelievable fool. I genuinely used to believe that because Sarah had spent her whole life in the country, she was just an honest, simple woman. Since she occasionally helped my mother-in-law keep an eye on my kids, I treated her with nothing but the highest respect. Whenever I visited home, I showered her family with expensive gifts. Every time I mailed boxes of new clothes and shoes for my kids, I always made sure to include brand new sets for her children too. And my reward? She effortlessly stole the very fruits of my lifelong labor. Honestly, I don't even blame her for stealing the comfortable life I rightfully earned. If she had the manipulative talent to pluck another person's peaches, that was her own dark skill. The people I truly hated were my children, for being so fundamentally blind to right and wrong. And I hated myself for being so stubbornly, single-minded and completely blind to the truth for decades. Most of all, I hated the venomous calculated words she whispered by Rick's deathbed. That manipulative two-faced hypocrite. The more I thought about her smug face, the angrier I became. Panic briefly seizing me, I hurriedly touched my chest. Thank God, no lumps, no swelling. The breast tissue was perfectly healthy. Don't get angry, I muttered to myself, repeating a calming mantra. If you make yourself sick with rage, no one else will suffer for it but you. Slowly, I managed to talk myself down from the ledge of panic, and began meticulously mapping out how I was going to navigate this new life. Divorce was an absolute certainty. But it couldn't happen right now. First, my biological mother passed away a long time ago, and my father quickly remarried. I had absolutely no welcoming family home to return to. My legal residency, my share of the farmland, and my house were all inextricably tied up right here. If I demanded a divorce today, I would be walking away with absolutely nothing. Second, I had endured the excruciating pain of birthing and raising 3 children to this age. If I rashly demanded a divorce and abandoned them now, wouldn't they just hate me again? That wouldn't do. The bond between parent and child isn't something that can simply be severed with a piece of paper. Even if I was going to leave them behind, I had to ensure I was standing firmly on the moral high ground. I needed to walk away with my head held high, completely justified, to prevent them from endlessly harassing me in the future. And honestly, I already had the perfect justification brewing in my mind. Didn't Rick claim with his dying breath that Aunt Sarah was the ultimate good woman? The way he had looked at her before he died, there wasn't an ounce of innocence in that gaze. This time around, I was going to graciously give him the opportunity to explore that. Right now, the outside world beyond our valley was rapidly modernizing. Cities were booming, and even most rural families had managed to upgrade from crumbling wooden shacks to sturdy brick homes. But our family was still barely scraping by, hovering just above the poverty line. In my previous life, I had fed them all far too well. I had cushioned their lives so completely that they actually had the spare energy and audacity to complain that I hadn't spent enough time sitting on the couch with them. This time, I started by taking a hard calculating look at our pantry. I gathered every single valuable item of food we had left. There were about 4 pounds of thick smoked country ham hanging from the rafters. I took it down, wrapped it tightly in brown paper, and hid it at the very bottom of my old cedar chest. The 24 fresh farm eggs my hens had just laid, carefully packed into a box and hidden underneath the floorboards. The expensive store-bought pastries, the frosted cookies, and the fruit cakes we had purchased for the holidays. Every last one of them was swept up and locked away. For dinner, I took a few heads of wilted frost-bitten cabbage, roughly chopped them up, and boiled them into a thin tasteless potato broth, with some pickled vegetables I found in a jar. When Rick and the children came in from the cold, their faces immediately fell as they looked at the pathetic meal set before them. They all grimaced in unison. "Is this it?" Rick asked, poking the watery cabbage with his spoon. "Where is the smoked ham?" I calmly took a sip of my bland broth. "We finished it all entertaining guests over the holidays. You know how expensive fresh meat is at the market right now. We only have about $100 left to our name. You know this, Rick frowned, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. How can we only have $100? Weren't we supposed to have our travel money for the city? I slammed my bowl down on the wooden table with a sharp crack. That money was borrowed. Since I'm not going, I already returned it to the lenders. How can you even have the nerve to bring that up? Rick was the epitome of a man who lived only for today, entirely oblivious to the consequences of tomorrow. He waved a hand dismissively. Well, just go to the butcher tomorrow and get a few pounds of beef. It's still technically the holiday season. If the neighbors see us eating like this, we'll be a laughingstock. Oh really? I snapped back. Spring is right around the corner. Are we not buying fertilizer? Are we not buying seeds for the fields? Are we not paying the school fees for the boys? In the past, I had always desperately tried to protect his fragile male ego. Even when I was swallowing my own blood and broken teeth from sheer exhaustion, I never once uttered a single word of complaint about him in front of the children. Because of my silence, my children grew up believing their father was just a gentle, honest, hard-working man who was victimized by life, while I was the tyrannical, money-obsessed villain of the family. In this life, I wanted nothing more than to crush him beneath my heel. And frankly, I was only stating the absolute truth. He was utterly, hopelessly useless. Rick fell silent, unable to argue with the brutal math. The rest of the dinner was eaten in a tense, suffocating silence. The food tasted like ash. After dinner, little Lily waited until her brothers were distracted before creeping up to me, tugging on my sleeve with a practiced, endearing pout. Mommy, I saw some eggs in the cupboard yesterday. Can you boil one for me? She was incredibly cute, with a round, cherubic face and massive, innocent eyes. In my previous life, out of all three of my children, I had loved her the most fiercely and unconditionally. While working in the city, I had seen so many brilliant independent professional women sitting in towering glass skyscrapers, wearing immaculate suits, proving they were just as capable as any man. I poured my heart and soul into Lily, desperately hoping she would become one of those women, and for a while she didn't disappoint me. She tested into a prestigious, top-tier university. When they graduated, I bought all three of my children properties, but while I only paid the down payments for her brothers, I bought Lily's expensive city condo entirely in cash. And how did she repay me? The moment she graduated, she got pregnant and immediately married the first loser she found, instantly becoming a stay-at-home mother. With zero ambitions, the man she married was a cheap, manipulative penny pincher. While they were dating, his idea of romance was taking her to free public parks, and for her birthday, he cooked her plain, watery oatmeal. Yet, she treated him like an absolute treasure. She viciously accused me of being a classist snob, and demanded that I put his name on the deed to the condo I had paid for. When her brothers and their wives found out I had paid for her condo in full while only giving them down payments, all hell broke loose. They hated me for my blatant favoritism, but instead of being grateful for my sacrifice, Lily blamed me. She accused me of being manipulative and failing to balance the scales evenly, claiming my actions had deliberately alienated her from her brothers and made her a pariah in the family. If she was so miserable, why didn't she just give the condo back to me? Later, when the real estate market skyrocketed, she allowed her loser husband to sweet-talk her into selling the property. Naturally, the moment the cash hit the bank, he drained the accounts and vanished into thin air. Left entirely destitute with a child, she completely gave up. She didn't even try to get a job. Instead, she quickly married another man, this time moving away to a remote, impoverished farming town. Everything I had built for her, all my high hopes and millions of dollars in cultivation, was reduced to a pathetic, tragic joke. Because of that, I actually hated her even more than I hated my sons. What eggs? I replied, my voice completely devoid of warmth. I sold every last one of them to scrape together enough money for your brother's school tuition. From now on, we're having plain cabbage soup every day. Isn't that your favorite? Lily's lower lip trembled, thrusting out in an exaggerated pout. I don't know where she picked up the phrase, but she suddenly yelled, "You're sexist. You just favor boys over girls." I almost laughed out loud. Sexist? You have no idea what is coming for you. Little girl, Your good days haven't even started yet. In my previous life, I had sacrificed my very flesh and bone to give them the world. And they all called me selfish. Fine. In this life, I was going to show them what true, unadulterated selfishness actually looked like. Isn't that how every family works? I said coldly, crossing my arms. But Aunt Sarah boiled an egg for Cousin Chloe today, she protested loudly, tears welling in her eyes. Then go ask Aunt Sarah to be your mother, I stated flatly. Turning my back on her, I gathered the empty soup bowls, tossed them unceremoniously into the cast iron sink, and yelled for my eldest. Mason, get in here and wash these dishes. Do you all think I was born just to serve you hand and foot? From now on, everyone works. If you don't do your chores, you don't get to eat. Grumbling and complaining under their breath, my two sons reluctantly dragged themselves to the sink to scrub the pots. I handed Lily a broom and ordered her to sweep the floor. I pulled a rickety wooden chair to the center of the room, sat down like a tyrannical queen dowager, and began lazily cracking roasted sunflower seeds between my teeth. I pointed fingers, barking out orders and criticisms. I was being incredibly mean and petty, but God, it felt absolutely fantastic. The days flew by, and soon it was time for the new school semester to begin. Instead of going to the market to buy them fresh, colorful new supplies like I usually did, I simply dug out their battered, faded backpacks from last year. I tossed them a handful of chewed-up pencils and half-used erasers. There, walk yourselves to school, I told the boys, shutting the door behind them. As for Lily, in my past life, I was so desperate for her to have the same advantages as the rich city kids that the moment I made my first paycheck in the factories, I enrolled her in an expensive private preschool in the neighboring town. By the time she hit first grade, she was miles ahead of her peers, and she maintained that academic lead for years. But what good did all that elite education actually do her? In the end, she still threw it all away to live on a farm and serve a useless man. It was better not to educate her at all, and save the country's wasted educational resources. So, I didn't enroll her in preschool. Surprisingly, she didn't throw a tantrum about it. In this rural area in 2003, early childhood education was practically non-existent. You had to travel to the main township just to find a preschool. Most farming parents didn't see the value in it, and refused to waste the money. So almost no one went. Especially not girls. In my past life, Lily had been the sole privileged exception in our entire village. Now, she was finally just like everyone else. I unceremoniously dropped Lily off at my mother-in-law's house and hopped onto my rusty bicycle, pedaling the 5 miles into the county town. I headed straight for the local internet cafe. I needed to find a job. The salary didn't need to be astronomical, just enough to feed myself and build a personal safety net. But it absolutely had to be a leisurely, low-stress position. Within an hour of browsing local forums, I struck gold. The Oakhaven Mill, a famous regional factory that produced maple syrup, cider and confectionaries, was hiring a warehouse inventory clerk. The factory was situated right off the main state highway, barely 5 miles from my house. It would take me less than 30 minutes to commute by bike. The job description was straightforward: managing the logs for raw materials entering and leaving the warehouse. The requirements were simple: a high school diploma, or vocational equivalent, basic computer skills, phone etiquette, and clear, unaccented English. In my previous life, I had eventually worked my way up to management in massive, highly regulated corporate factories. These basic clerical tasks would be absolute child's play for me. As for the education requirement, that was a delightfully easy problem to solve. I immediately caught a cheap bus into the city center. I navigated a series of narrow, shady alleyways until I found a notorious underground printer. For a crisp $100 bill, I purchased a blank, highly convincing diploma from a defunct regional vocational college. It even featured a genuine, raised steel seal. I filled in my personal details right there on the counter. In 2003, the national online education verification systems were barely in their infancy, and they could only track bachelor's degrees and above. Vocational and high school diplomas were entirely off the grid. Employers simply looked for the raised seal. And since the school had gone bankrupt years ago, there was zero chance of them verifying it. It was a flawless plan. I wrote down that I attended from 1993 to 1995, majoring in accounting. It didn't matter that I wasn't a CPA. An inventory clerk wouldn't be handling actual cash anyway. Armed with my shiny new credentials, I marched straight into the Oakhaven Mills HR office for an interview. Just as I suspected, the manager asked me a few basic logistical questions, which I answered with polished professional ease. They were incredibly impressed. The manager barely glanced at my fake diploma before nodding eagerly. "Your qualifications are perfect," the HR manager said with a smile. "Now, because this specific warehouse is located in a rural sector, it is really only busy for about 2 months out of the year, during the autumn harvest and the winter holiday rush. Therefore, the base salary is 20% lower than our city positions. It pays $600 a month, but it includes free room and board on site. We adjust the salary annually based on performance." I was absolutely thrilled. Right now, the average monthly wage in the sprawling cities was around $800 to $900, while the local county average was a dismal $400 to $500. "Is this a full-time official position? Does it include health insurance and benefits?" I asked eagerly. "Yes, absolutely," the manager confirmed. "The only difference is the slightly lower rural wage scale. All other benefits, including insurance and retirement contributions, are identical to our corporate staff and comply with state labor laws." I happily signed the employment contract on the spot. The warehouse staff was currently on a post-holiday break, so I was scheduled to report for duty in 2 weeks. The moment I pushed my bicycle into our dirt courtyard, I was greeted by the loud, dramatic wailing of my 3 children. Mason, my eldest, was sobbing furiously. Because we didn't pay the optional activity fee, the teacher made me wipe down all the desks while everyone else played, and then she made me stand in the back of the classroom for the whole lesson. Lucas chimed in, tears streaking his dirty face. The other kids pointed and laughed at me. Lily was stomping her feet in a puddle. "I don't want to wear Cousin Chloe's ugly old hand-me-downs anymore." Chloe was Aunt Sarah and Uncle Tom's daughter, exactly Lily's age, because Aunt Sarah's family lived closer to the township and had a bit more disposable income from their farming. She frequently sent bags of Chloe's old, outgrown clothes to us. Wearing a cousin's hand-me-downs was incredibly common in poor rural communities. But that was the past. These days, children were developing their own sense of pride and vanity much earlier. They couldn't handle the playground mockery, hence the tears. "Is this all it takes to break you?" I thought coldly. "If you think this is bad, you're going to drown in your own tears later in life." Seeing me walk in, they cranked up the volume, wailing even louder. "Mom, the teacher said we have to bring the money tomorrow, or we have to stand in the back every single day." It was such a trivial, pathetic issue. Public education was mandated by law. A teacher couldn't legally kick them out of the classroom for not paying an optional fee. The most they could do was employ a little cold shoulder psychology to pressure the parents into coughing up the cash. When you belong to a truly poor family, having a fragile ego is an absolute luxury you cannot afford. It's better to discard it early. I casually wiped a fake tear from my own eye. "What do you want me to do? Look at other children's fathers. They go out to the city, work on construction sites, and make thousands of dollars a year. Of course, they can buy their kids whatever they want. But look at your father. He lies around all day, lazy and useless. How can you possibly compare yourselves to them? Mommy originally wanted to go to the city to work and earn money for you. But you all threw a tantrum and stopped me. So, just endure it. The teacher wouldn't dare hit you. And even if she does, she won't kill you." Rick, who had been lingering in the doorway, turned bright red, thoroughly humiliated by my vicious dressing down. "Fine. I'll go into town tomorrow and find some day labor," he muttered defensively. I looked up at the sky. The heavy gray clouds were rolling over the mountains, bringing a bitter biting chill. It was almost certainly going to snow heavily tonight. Where exactly was he going to find outdoor day labor in a blizzard? And even if there was work, would he actually drag himself out of bed to do it? Not a chance. It was all empty talk. I smiled thinly at the kids. Did you hear that? Your father said he is going to go make lots of money for us. Soon you'll have all the delicious food and nice things you want. Just wait patiently. The children's eyes lit up with desperate hope. Okay. They chorused. That night, exactly as I predicted, a massive snowstorm hit. The wind howled, shaking the wooden frames of the house, and snow piled up thickly against the windows. Our blankets were incredibly thin. Rick was a furnace of natural body heat, so he managed to sleep soundly, completely unbothered. But the three children had to cram themselves onto one tiny bed, stacking their meager quilts together, just to keep from freezing to death. Tomorrow, they would still have to trudge through the snow to school. They had winter coats, but they were old, stiff, and 2 sizes too small. They would just have to make do. In my previous life, I only ever got to see them for a few hurried days during the holidays. But almost every single month I mailed massive boxes back home. Brand new down jackets, expensive boots, the finest stationery. They lacked for absolutely nothing. And what did my daughters say to me then? All you know how to do is send money. But what I actually need is your love. Oh, I see, I thought, pulling my quilt up to my chin. So none of you actually like money. Well then, I'll just have to keep it all for myself. As for love, the next morning I gathered up Chloe's ugliest, most faded hand-me-downs and cheerfully handed them over to our neighbor. I then turned to Lily and smiled warmly. Our Lily is such a good girl. You don't care about wearing fancy clothes or eating expensive food, and you're so hardworking. Now, be a good girl and go shovel the chicken manure out of the coop. Lily recoiled, deeply reluctant. She had never been forced to do hard farm chores before, but when she met my dark, unyielding gaze, she swallowed her complaints, grabbed the shovel, and trudged out into the freezing snow, her lips pressed tightly together. Rick was still snoring loudly in bed, oblivious to the world. I walked over and ruthlessly kicked him in the thigh until he woke up. I saw a flyer yesterday, I demanded. A small lumber yard on the edge of the county is looking for a night watchman to guard the front gate. Rick rubbed his eyes, barely awake. How much does it pay a month? $200. I replied flatly. Rick instantly rolled over, turning his back to me. That is way too low. I'm not going. Fine, then I'll go, I threatened. Rick rolled back over, irritated. Are you insane? If you're not at home, who is going to take care of the kids? My face hardened into a mask of pure ice. Are you dead? What are you here for? It is just such a tiny amount of money, he whined. It is not even worth getting out of bed for. I'd be better off going to the city to do real work. I let out a harsh, mocking laugh. Such a tiny amount of money. Your ego is truly massive for a man with empty pockets. $200 a month is $2,400 a year. Can your precious farming family even make that much in a whole year? Rick fell completely silent. If you refuse to go make money, and you refuse to watch your own children, do you just want this family to starve to death? I hissed, cornered and shamed. He finally grumbled his agreement when my parents-in-law heard the news that I had secured a formal, contracted warehouse job at the mill. They were absolutely overjoyed. Their generation held a deep, reverent worship for factory workers and steady paychecks. You just focus on your new job, my mother-in-law promised enthusiastically. We will make sure the children are well taken care of. I agreed to give them $100 a month for household expenses. It didn't sound like a fortune, but since they grew their own grain and vegetables, it was more than enough to cover occasional meat and basic utilities. With his parents enthusiastically taking over the childcare duties, Rick had absolutely zero responsibilities left. Unsurprisingly, he embraced this freedom by becoming even lazier, settling perfectly into the trap I had laid for him. As soon as the harsh winter began to thaw, I eagerly reported for duty at the Oakhaven Mill warehouse. The storage facility was a sprawling 6,000 square foot brick building. Including myself, there were exactly 5 employees. 2 older women who handled the cleaning and cooking, and 2 security guards who worked alternate day and night shifts. I was the sole white-collar manager on site. I was given exclusive use of a spacious private office, as well as a cozy, attached studio apartment that came fully equipped with a washing machine, a television, and even a window air conditioning unit. It couldn't compare to the modern high-rises of the city I remembered from my past life. But compared to my drafty, miserable farmhouse, it was an absolute paradise, since the warehouse primarily stored barrels of maple syrup, bulk sugar, and crates of confectionaries. The winter and spring were our slow seasons. The factory trucks only came by every 2 or 3 days to pick up pallets. All I had to do was accurately log the inventory numbers. I actively worked for barely 2 hours a day. The rest of the time was entirely mine to control. I used the factory's dial-up internet to enroll in online accounting courses, purchasing textbooks to study for my official certification. Before long, my first payday arrived. I went straight to the butcher and bought 3 pounds of premium, thick-cut beef roast, along with a carton of expensive cigarettes. Before biking back to the village, the children hadn't seen fresh red meat in weeks, and they jumped up and down with uncontainable excitement. I didn't feel like cooking, so I casually announced I was taking the meat over to my parents-in-law's house for dinner. I deliberately walked at a snail's pace. Whenever I passed a neighbor's house, I stopped to chat loudly. Yes, I'm so grateful to my in-laws for helping watch the kids. I bought this premium roast just to thank them. I practically shouted over the fences. It was a meager half-mile walk, but I stretched it out for nearly 40 minutes. By the time I actually arrived at their door, the entire village knew I had bought 3 pounds of expensive beef for my in-laws, and everyone was loudly praising my incredible filial piety. My father-in-law, realizing I was now holding a prestigious salaried factory job, was incredibly polite and deferential to me. "You should really be saving your salary. Why go to such expense for us?" he chuckled. I sat at the head of the table like royalty, while Aunt Sarah slaved away in the hot kitchen. The only substantial dish on the table was the beef stew she made. However, beneath a thin top layer of actual meat, the entire pot was stuffed with cheap, starchy potatoes. There were barely 2 or 3 small pieces of beef per person. Without a shred of hesitation, I reached over and scooped up 3 of the largest, thickest cuts of beef for myself, while Rick managed to snag 2. The children were left with scraps. My father-in-law distributed a small piece to each of my sons, but Lily got absolutely nothing. Desperate, she tugged sharply at my sleeve. I finally picked out a piece for her, but I deliberately bit off the tender lean meat for myself, and casually dropped the chewy fatty rind onto her plate. She ate it with absolute relish anyway, starved for the flavor, watching my children scramble for scraps. A complex knot of emotions twisted in my chest. For a brief fleeting second, I felt a pang of doubt. In my previous life, had I genuinely been wrong? Even though I had provided them with endless, overflowing material wealth, I was hundreds of miles away, and missed their entire childhoods. If one child hated me, it might be a personality clash, but for all 3 to despise me, maybe I really was a terrible mother. But the guilt vanished instantly. Even if I was a terrible mother, I had no intention of changing, good or bad, as long as I lived a comfortable, happy life this time around. That was all that mattered. After dinner, the sky grew dark, and we walked back to our own house. Rick was visibly annoyed. 3 pounds of meat, and barely half of it even made it to the table. "I bet Sarah hid the rest to feed her own kids later," he grumbled. In my past life, I had often felt my in-laws were incredibly biased. Uncle Tom and Aunt Sarah never left the village to work, yet they somehow afforded home renovations, obviously heavily subsidized by the grandparents. But how did Rick respond back then? I perfectly mimicked his old hypocritical tone. "We are all one big family, Rick. Don't be so calculating and divide things so clearly. The children eat over there all the time, and Sarah puts a lot of effort into cooking. You're just being far too petty." Mason, my eldest, chimed in with a scowl. "It was the money my mom earned that bought the meat. Why do they get to eat more of it than us?" Poverty truly breeds small-mindedness. In my previous life, these cousins had been as close as blood brothers. Now, they were bitterly counting ounces of beef. Mason looked at me with pleading eyes. "Mom, your warehouse is so close to home. Just move back here and live with us. We love the food you cook better anyway." This was not a sentiment he genuinely felt. He just wanted a live-in maid. I shifted my gaze to Rick, who immediately looked away, intensely guilty. "Mommy's work is incredibly demanding," I sighed dramatically. "I'm up before dawn and work until dusk. Commuting back and forth would waste too much time. Tell you what, Rick. How about I quit my job and come home to take care of the kids? And you go work at the lumber mill. I heard the wages are great. 3 months there equals a whole year of my salary," Rick stammered, backing away. "I'll look for something after the spring planting is done." I let out a sharp, derisive sneer and turned to my son. "Whenever your father decides to step up and be a real man who can actually support his family, I'll come back. Otherwise, the 3 of you are going to starve to death." That night, Rick tried to slide his hands under my shirt in bed, looking for intimacy. Just looking at him made my skin crawl with pure nausea. I kicked him hard in the shin, shoving him away. "I have to get up early for work," I snapped, turning my back to him. The next morning, before the sun even crested the hills, I rode back to the warehouse. The grueling spring planting season started in the village. And then it ended. Most of the able-bodied men in town left for construction jobs in the city. But Rick claimed he had thrown out his back and needed months of bed rest. He grew lazier and more useless by the day. He couldn't even be bothered to cook properly. The children ate whenever he managed to boil a pot of plain pasta. And when they were starving, they had to go beg for food at their grandmother's house, where Aunt Sarah frequently screamed at them for being parasites. All 3 of my kids became as thin as rails. Their clothes were stained dark with grease and dirt. They looked like absolute urchins. They were the filthiest children in the village, and none of the other kids wanted to play with them. Consequently, they grew withdrawn and sullen, and their grades completely tanked. This was the reality of a father taking care of the kids. As long as they were technically breathing, it was considered a success. If a mother had stayed home and let her children look like this, her spine would have been shattered by the weight of the town's gossiping and judgment. By the time the heavy summer harvest rolled around, I was fully settled into my comfortable routine. One sweltering afternoon, the security guard knocked on my office door. "There is a guy at the gate looking for you. Says he is your husband." I put down my accounting textbook and walked out toward the main gate. Sure enough, it was Rick. He was deeply tanned and had lost a significant amount of weight. He was wearing his cleanest set of clothes, though the cuffs of his jeans were still caked in dried mud. In my past life, despite being a blue-collar worker, I had eventually managed major factory floors and learned strict corporate management standards. Upon taking over this warehouse, I had aggressively implemented the Fives workplace organization methodology. Whenever the corporate executives from the city visited, I was showered with praise, and we were even awarded Model Warehouse of the Year. Because my facility was run with absolute military-like precision, the security guards no longer just casually let visitors wander in like they used to. They strictly adhered to the authorized personnel-only protocols, keeping Rick firmly locked outside the heavy iron gates. He stood by the brick wall, his head bowed like a scolded child. "Evelyn," he mumbled, using my real name. "Something terrible happened at home." It turned out Uncle Tom had been operating a heavy motorized log splitter. The wood was too thick, causing the machine to buck violently. A heavy steel guard plate snapped off the machine and slammed downward, severely injuring 2 of his toes. I gasped in exaggerated shock. I vaguely remembered this incident from my past life. Back then, I had immediately wired $3,000 back home, allowing him to get emergency reattachment surgery. He healed perfectly and suffered no long-term limp. "How bad is it?" I asked, feigning deep concern. Rick shook his head grimly. "It was a clean slice right through the boot. The doctor at the county hospital said they can easily reattach the toes since they just fell off. But it's going to cost a fortune." "How much?" "At least $3,000 or $4,000. Rick sighed. "In 2003, we didn't have comprehensive rural health care. Every cent had to be paid out of pocket. We'll just have to ask the relatives for loans and see if we can scrape it together, I offered smoothly. Rick scoffed. Are you crazy? It is his foot. If he wants it fixed, he can go beg for the money himself. I talked to Sarah, and she basically said they aren't going to do the surgery. It's only the pinky and ring toes on his left foot anyway. It won't stop him from walking or farming. I stood there, momentarily stunned. My mindset was still tethered to 2026, where physical health and wholeness were valued above all else. But for these people, $4,000 was an astronomical, life-ruining sum. Faced with crushing debt, a minor physical deformity suddenly seemed entirely acceptable to them. Uncle Tom was certainly pathetic. But remembering how he and Sarah had happily drained my blood in my past life, only to mock me behind my back, I couldn't summon a single ounce of genuine sympathy. Then why did you come looking for me? I asked coldly. Rick rubbed his dirty hands together, nervously. We don't have a single dollar left at home. Mom said we at least need to buy Tom some nutrient-rich bone broth and pork trotters to help him heal. So she told me to come ask you for some cash. I pulled a crisp $50 bill from my pocket and handed it to him. Watching him practically skip away, a dark thought bloomed in my mind. I stopped at a roadside farm stand, bought a basket of expensive, dark red cherries, and headed straight to the hospital. If I was going to play the game, I had to keep up appearances perfectly. As I approached the ward, I could hear Uncle Tom crying and groaning in agony. Aunt Sarah's usual facade of the gentle, devoted farm wife was entirely gone. Her face was twisted in disgust and impatience. Why on earth would we reattach them? You heard the doctor. It costs thousands. And there is no guarantee it'll even heal right. Why waste the money? But I'll be a cripple. Tom sobbed. They're toes, not fingers, Sarah snapped fiercely. It won't stop you from walking, eating, or working the fields. If we borrow thousands of dollars for this, we'll be paying off that debt for the rest of our lives. How are we supposed to survive? Tom instantly fell silent, thoroughly beaten down. I pushed the door open and set the cherries on the bedside table. Rick went to buy you some meat for broth, so I brought some fruit. Cherries are great for reducing inflammation, I said sweetly. Tom looked at me with tear-filled eyes. Evelyn, I'm going to be disabled for the rest of my life, he choked out. His face was swollen and pale, his skin taking on a sickly grayish hue from the lack of heavy painkillers. Even though I hated him, seeing him like this made me feel a tiny sliver of pity. But in Sarah's eyes, there was nothing but cold, hard annoyance. When you are that poor, human life and dignity hold absolutely no value. Not even the sacred bond of marriage. Not even a man's own flesh and bone. I stayed for a few minutes, offered some hollow words of comfort, and excused myself. I had barely reached the hospital lobby when Aunt Sarah came rushing down the stairs after me. Evelyn, wait. Can you lend me some money? I raised an eyebrow in feigned shock. Money for what? I just gave Rick $50 for the groceries. Sarah wiped away a tear, her eyes darting around nervously. Look at Tom. What can I possibly rely on him for now? I want to leave. I want to go to the city and find work. Please just lend me enough for a bus ticket and a week of rent. I almost laughed in her face. Tom was severely injured and would be bedridden for months. Who was going to tend the fields, feed the animals, and take care of the kids? Furthermore, if she took my money and ran, the entire family would blame me for aiding her escape. I reached out and gently held her rough, calloused hands, my voice dripping with false syrupy concern. Sarah, please don't scare me like this. You've never been outside the county limits. You have no idea how dangerous the city is. Just the other day, I read in the paper about motorcycle gangs mugging women and dragging them down the street. And the job market, it is full of scammers and human traffickers. Besides, you have 3 beautiful children at home. Could you really bear to abandon them? The outside world isn't as glamorous as you think. Honestly, a woman who never has to leave her home is truly the most blessed woman of all. I quoted her own future words right back at her. Savoring the irony, Sarah let out a heavy, defeated sigh. I suppose it was just a fleeting thought. But with Tom like this, I just don't know how we're going to survive. I smiled apologetically. I only had a little bit saved up, and I just gave it all to Rick. If you really need emergency cash, you'll have to ask him for it. Sarah looked at me, her eyes filled with deep, gnawing envy. You speak with so much confidence now. Are you really making $200 a month just sitting at a desk? I am, I confirmed cheerfully. I can tell, she muttered bitterly. Your skin is so pale and clear, and your hands are so soft. You don't even look like a country woman anymore. I chuckled softly, lifting my hand to subtly show off my freshly manicured nails, and the scent of the expensive lavender lotion I had just bought. Since my rebirth, every single penny I earned went entirely toward myself. I bought the nice clothes and high-end skincare I had brutally denied myself in my past life. I was naturally slim. And now that I was out of the sun and well-fed, my skin had become porcelain smooth and radiant. I looked like a completely different woman. Even young guys in town had started giving me double takes. When you don't bake in the sun all day and don't break your back with heavy lifting, anyone can look soft and young, I whispered conspiratorially. Sarah, you're only 30 years old. You really need to start loving yourself more. Uncle Tom was discharged after a week, but the doctor strictly ordered him to stay off his feet for at least 6 months. Because it was incredibly hot, and his wound was prone to infection. He was moved into my grandparents' in-laws' old house, which was the only building in the family compound with an electric ceiling fan. He planned to move back to his own house once the autumn chill set in. Meanwhile, back at the warehouse, corporate decided to upgrade our electrical grid. They sent an engineer down from the city headquarters to oversee the rewiring. That evening, a major breaker blew, plunging the entire warehouse into total darkness. Since there was no work to be done, I decided to take the rare opportunity to bike home and check on things. I wanted to slip in and out quietly, avoiding Rick's inevitable demands for money. I arrived at my house under the cover of darkness. The kids were fast asleep, but Rick was nowhere to be found. Out in the courtyard, I noticed the laundry hanging on the line. Rick's ratty old underwear, which had been full of holes for months, had been meticulously stitched up and neatly pinned to the wire. Rick couldn't even boil an egg, let alone sew. My heart skipped a beat as the pieces rapidly fell into place. I crept silently out of my yard and slipped over toward Uncle Tom's house. Since Tom was recovering in the grandparents' house on the other side of the village, this house should have been quiet, but it wasn't. As I pressed my back against the brick wall, I heard the distinct, muffled sounds of heavy breathing and rhythmic creaking leaking through a cracked window. I crept closer and peered through the glass. There, illuminated by the pale moonlight, caught in a shameless betrayal on Tom's bed, were Rick and Aunt Sarah. A heavy phantom blow struck my chest. Even though I had fully anticipated this exact scenario, seeing it with my own 2 eyes still triggered a deep, visceral wave of nausea. All those decades of backbreaking labor, all that sacrifice in my past life, it was all for this pathetic, treacherous worm of a man. But the nausea quickly gave way to a surge of pure icy relief. Thank God I had completely cut off my emotional attachment. The second I was reborn, I had even intentionally pushed them together. I hadn't let Rick touch me once since my return, and a man like him, lazy, entitled, and possessing zero self-control, was bound to snap. Sarah was broke, desperate, and constantly asking him for my money. One thing led to another, judging by how bold and coordinated they were being in her own marital bed. This was clearly not their first time. In a village like this, people had nothing better to do than spy on their neighbors. Secrets were impossible to keep. Even if they weren't caught tonight, they would inevitably be exposed. Smiling coldly to myself in the dark, I didn't make a sound. I turned around, got back on my bike, and pedaled straight back to the warehouse. Lying in my comfortable, clean bed back at the warehouse, my mind kept replaying the filthy scene I had just witnessed, suddenly feeling incredibly hot and suffocated. I couldn't sleep. I grabbed my towel and a bucket, heading toward the communal washroom to take a cold shower. When I reached the washroom, however, someone was already there. It was the corporate engineer, Julian, a brilliant, highly educated young man who had just graduated from a top university in Seattle. He was the one overseeing the electrical upgrades. And in just a few days, I had learned a massive amount about logistics software from him. During the day, he seemed quiet, refined, and entirely strictly professional. But right now, he was shirtless, wearing only a pair of gym shorts, splashing cold water over his head from the sink. The water traced the sharply defined lines of his back and chest, illuminated by the pale moonlight streaming through the frosted glass. I instinctively stepped back, my rubber sandals squeaking loudly against the damp tile. Julian turned around, grabbing a towel to wipe his face. "Evelyn, did I scare you?" No," I stammered, my throat suddenly entirely dry. "Why are you out here so late? The power grid is still down. There is a lot of expensive equipment lying around, so I decided to sleep on a cot in the main office to keep an eye on things," he explained smoothly. "Aren't the mosquitoes biting you alive? Do you want me to bring you some bug spray?" I heard myself ask, the invitation hanging heavily in the humid air. He smiled, a slow, deliberate smirk. "Yes, I would like that." I led him back toward my private studio apartment. The moment I unlocked the door and stepped inside, he followed closely behind. He took a deep breath, his voice dropping an octave as his breath brushed against the nape of my neck. "Evelyn, it smells so good in here." I don't know who made the first move. By the time he had pressed me against the heavy wooden door, my hands were already trailing down his chest. My only coherent thought was that he had to be at least 5 or 6 years younger than me. "Are you really single?" I managed to gasp. "Yes," he whispered fiercely, leaning down to capture my lips. It felt like a wildfire had ignited, burning a path down my neck and collarbone. My mind went entirely blank. He knew exactly who I was, a married woman from a rural town. So there were no false promises of forever. He likely just saw me as a lonely trapped housewife, looking for a discreet, no strings attached escape. And I was equally mesmerized by his youthful energy and sharp intellect. We were simply two consenting adults, taking exactly what we needed from each other. For the next month we worked side by side during the day, maintaining absolute professional boundaries. But at night, we lost ourselves in each other, forgetting the rest of the world. The weeks flew by, and I realized I was dangerously close to genuinely falling in love with him. But on our final night together, he was explicitly clear. "The grid project is finished. I have to go back to corporate headquarters in Seattle tomorrow. I probably won't be coming back out this way again." I bit down hard on his shoulder, tasting the faint metallic tang of blood. "Then don't waste time talking," I ordered. Julian laughed softly, pulling me closer. The next morning he was gone. He drifted through my life like a passing storm, leaving the ground wet before vanishing over the horizon. It wasn't until over a month later, when I realized my period was completely entirely late, that panic finally set in. I took a bus into the city, walked into a private clinic and took a test. Sure enough, I was pregnant. I sat on a park bench, utterly stunned. I had been so caught up in the thrill of my newly reclaimed life that I completely forgot this 20-something-year-old body was highly fertile. Looking out at the skyline, knowing Julian was somewhere in that city, my heart was a chaotic mess of sweet, bitter, and terrifying emotions. Would a brilliant, successful young man with a limitless future really want anything to do with a married rural woman who already had 3 kids? I wasn't delusional, but the thought of this baby, a child who would inherit his sharp mind and my fierce drive, filled me with an overwhelming sense of anticipation. I was going to keep the baby. I was going to be a mother one more time, and this time, I would do it entirely right. But first, I needed a divorce. The moment I stepped off the bus at the edge of the village, I immediately noticed the neighbors staring at me with wide, scandalized eyes. "Evelyn, you're back," a woman yelled, her voice artificially loud, clearly trying to signal someone. Doors instantly cracked open, and people began spilling out of their yards, watching me like hawks. I knew exactly what had happened. Rick and Aunt Sarah's filthy little secret had finally exploded into the light of day. I kept my face entirely neutral, just taking a quick break from the warehouse. "We're gearing up for the autumn syrup harvest, so I'm incredibly busy." "You shouldn't focus so much on work, Evelyn. You need to keep a closer eye on your man," An older woman shouted from her porch. I played completely dumb. Rick? Oh, I don't need to watch him. He is at home with his mother and Sarah. I trust them completely. The collective grimace that swept through the crowd was absolutely priceless. When I walked through my front gate, I found Rick lying face down on a woven mat in the living room. He was shirtless, and his back was covered in furious crisscrossing marks and severe bruises that were just beginning to scab over. His father had severely disciplined him physically. I stood over him, silent and cold as ice. Rick scrambled to his knees, tears streaming down his bruised face. Evelyn, I'm so sorry. I made a mistake, it meant nothing. We are getting a divorce, I stated flatly. I walked into the bedroom, grabbed my lockbox with my birth certificate and identification, and turned to leave. Rick tried to block the door, begging and pleading. I grabbed a heavy wooden laundry bat from the corner, and chased him out into the front yard for all the neighbors to see. Do you really think I don't know that you and your brother's wife are the absolute disgrace of this county? I screamed at the top of my lungs. You will sign the divorce papers today, or I will drag you to the county courthouse, file a massive public lawsuit, and buy a full-page ad in the newspaper detailing exactly what you did. Rick, who was fundamentally a cowardly, spineless man, crumbled completely. I dragged him to the county clerk's office and finalized the divorce. I left him the crumbling house, the worthless farmland, and full custody of all 3 children. When I returned to the village to collect my bicycle, a horrific piercing wail echoed from my in-laws' compound. It sounded like an animal dying. Uncle Tom had tragically taken his own life. When my father-in-law discovered the body, the sheer shock and horror triggered a massive fatal stroke. Father and son died on the exact same day. The news sent absolute shockwaves through the county. I had initially planned to say a final formal goodbye to my children, but hearing the wailing, I knew exactly how my mother-in-law operated. She would inevitably try to blame this entire tragedy on me for publicly exposing the affair. Without a second thought, I turned my bike around and fled. I went straight to the warehouse manager and requested an immediate transfer to the corporate headquarters in Seattle. Cashing in all my unused vacation time with a small suitcase, I boarded a train to the city, exhausted, nauseous, and emotionally drained. I finally called Julian. I didn't want him to take responsibility. I just needed a friendly face to help me navigate the massive corporate transfer process. The moment we met at a cafe, he completely bypassed small talk and pulled me into a crushing hug. Are you mad at me? I shouldn't have left like that. The second I got back to the city, I realized I made a huge mistake. I'm in love with you, Evelyn. You feel the same way, don't you? Looking into his desperate, earnest eyes, I decided to take a leap of faith. I'm divorced, I told him bluntly. Because I'm pregnant. He froze, his eyes dropping to my stomach. Is it? I glared at him. He burst into a massive echoing laugh, sweeping me off my feet. Of course it is mine. I'm so sorry, I'm just an idiot. We quietly registered for a marriage license a week later. Julian was incredibly responsible, pampering me throughout my entire pregnancy. Because I was eating well and constantly loved, I practically glowed. I gave birth to a beautiful healthy baby boy with Julian's sharp nose and thick hair. We named him Leo. Julian practically did all the child rearing himself, only handing him to me when it was time to nurse. When my maternity leave ended, I took a brief trip back to the village. I learned that after the double funeral, my mother-in-law had completely lost her mind and refused to care for anyone. Aunt Sarah, who was now despised as the ultimate homewrecker and pariah of the county, threatened to sue Rick for physical harm if he didn't marry her. Left with 0 options and terrified of legal consequences, Rick married her. They were now legally raising 6 traumatized children under one miserable roof. When I saw my 3 kids, I barely recognized them. It was late autumn, but Mason was still wearing a threadbare, patched summer t-shirt that was 2 sizes too small. They burst into tears the moment they saw me. "Mommy!" they cried, throwing themselves at my legs like desperate, starving creatures. I gently but firmly peeled them off me. I handed them a small bag of cheap snacks and a few warm jackets. "You're old enough to understand now," I told them coldly. "Your father did something unforgivable, and we are divorced. Aunt Sarah is your mother now. I don't want her to be my mom. Mason screamed. But in my past life, that is exactly what you told me. I thought bitterly. You told me she was a real mother, and I was garbage. I'm married now, and I have a new baby. I continued, ignoring his tears. I won't be coming back to visit. Be good and study hard. I dropped off 2 cans of protein powder for my senile mother-in-law and walked away, never looking back. For the next 10 years, I only occasionally mailed them a box of old clothes, stopping entirely the moment they turned 18. Time flew by. It was suddenly 2026. The exact year I had died in my previous life, but this time, I was alive. My company had gone public. I held substantial founder's shares, and I was thoroughly comfortably wealthy. Julian was a top executive at a massive tech firm, and our son Leo was attending a prestigious Ivy League grad school, and that was exactly when my 3 estranged children suddenly tracked me down. Lucas, my second son, had been delivering food for an app. He spotted me walking into my luxury condo building, and somehow managed to buy my phone number online. They begged to meet. To avoid a public scene at my home, I agreed to meet them at a private lounge. Sitting across from them after 2 decades, it was a pathetic sight. So, how are your father and stepmother? I asked dryly, all 3 of their faces twisted in absolute, unified disgust. I already knew the answer. Rick had died 5 years ago in a drunken construction accident at a building site. The company paid out a $20,000 settlement. Sarah instantly stole every penny of it and ran off with another drifter. The kids didn't know where she went, but I did. She had tracked the drifter to a miserable deep mountain logging camp out west, only to discover he already had a wife. She was stranded there and never came back. Mom, how have you been? Mason asked, his eyes practically glued to the expensive silk of my blouse and the diamond watch on my wrist. I've been excellent, I replied. Mom, I want to buy a house in the city. Can you help me? Mason pleaded. Lucas echoed the sentiment, looking at me with greedy, desperate eyes. Lily remained silent, but she kept staring at my designer purse. I knew her story too. All 3 of them had dropped out of high school. The boys were in their 30s, broke, and sharing a tiny studio apartment. Lily had married a deadbeat at 20, and was already a divorced mother of 2, drowning in debt. They were absolute, fundamental failures. In my past life, I had sacrificed my very soul to drag them out of the mud, and they punished me for it. This time, I let them stay in the mud where they belonged. As your biological mother, my legal and moral obligations to you ended the day you turned 18, I said, my voice sharp as glass. Our paths are completely separate. Do not contact me again. Mason slammed his fist on the table, his face turning purple with rage. So you really aren't going to help us this time. You were reborn so early, but you just sat back and watched us fall straight into hell, Lucas sneered. Even if we were ungrateful back then, did you really have to be this ruthless? We were just kids. Lily finally spoke up, her face twisted with pure venom. You are so evil, Mom. Look at the miserable life I'm living. You always said you loved me the most. Why didn't you take me with you when you divorced him? Ah. So that was why they suddenly found me. They had all been reborn too. I have absolutely no idea what insane nonsense you 3 are talking about. I lied smoothly. Revealing my own rebirth would only validate their delusions and tie us together forever. I stood up, adjusting my coat. If you feel I've wronged you, hire a lawyer and sue me. Yes, I am incredibly wealthy, but my will is already ironclad. Every single cent, property, and asset I own is going directly to my youngest son, Leo. I gave him all my money, and I gave him all my love. I expect nothing from you, and you will get nothing from me. And if you ever try to harass me, stalk me, or spread rumors about my family, my corporate lawyers will crush you so completely that you won't even be able to get approved for a food delivery app background check. I didn't waste another breath on them. I walked out of the lounge, immediately put my luxury condo on the market, bought a better penthouse across town, and changed my number. They tried to find me a few more times, but building security barred them from even stepping on the sidewalk. Lily gave up first and crawled back to her miserable trailer park. Mason and Lucas actually looked into suing me for support, but when they realized they couldn't even afford the retainer fee for a paralegal, they finally surrendered to their pathetic reality. Our ties were severed forever. And I had never been happier.
That's all for today. I'm Lina. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more amazing stories every week. Thanks for watching.